So this is another version of this class binding syntax, which you should be aware of when working with Angular. It's also worth knowing that besides binding classes dynamically in Angular, you can actually also bind styles dynamically. So if you directly want to set a certain style. And you can do this again with square brackets and then the style keyword, the style property name. And then you can, again, just as with class, either pass in an object where you target different styles, like for example, font size. I'm using the string version since I have a dash in here. And you could then set this to a hard-coded value, like 64 pixels, or to the result of some TypeScript expression that produces that value. If you save that, you see the text is much bigger. Besides defining this property like this, you could also use this camel case notation here. This is an alternative you can use here for these styles if you're targeting a style that consists of multiple words that are separated by dashes. Since dashes aren't allowed here, you either have to wrap this with quotes or, as an alternative, use this camel case notation. The result will be the same. Now, if you're only targeting one single style, you can also use a shorter notation here, just as you could with class, and use style.fontSize in this example, and then directly set the value to which this style should be set. Again, this here, however, is some dynamically evaluated expression, so if you want to have a hard-coded string here, you must wrap it with quotes. Otherwise, it will be treated and executed as TypeScript code, and this is not valid TypeScript code. So the single quotes are needed here. With that, I still have that big text. Now, here I don't need to target any styles, so I'll get rid of that, but you should know about that just as you should know about this class binding feature. By the way, one place where you can see that style binding feature in action already in this application here is in a traffic component HTML file. In there, I'm using Angular's style binding feature to dynamically set the height style of that div to a calculated value, where I take the value of one of these data points and divide that by the highest possible value, multiply it with 100 to get a percentage between 0 and 100, and concatenate that to a string with the percentage sign at the end, so that the height style property of this div is set to some percentage between 0 and 100. And that was already part of the starting project. In case you wondered what this syntax was all about, well, now you know. That is Angular's style binding syntax. So we got this server status component, but at the moment the status never changes. Of course, in this demo application, we're not actually grabbing that server status from any real servers. But I want to simulate that it changes every couple of seconds to some random value, so either to offline, online, or unknown. And to make that work, we need to set up an interval that executes some code that will change that current status value every couple of seconds. And we could do that with help of the constructor. In there, we can call the built-in setInterval function, which is provided by JavaScript. So that's, of course, not Angular or TypeScript specific. And setInterval then takes a function which it will execute every X amount of milliseconds. And that's the second argument you must pass to setInterval. The amount of milliseconds it should wait until it executes this function again. And here, let's say we want to wait 5 seconds, which would be 5,000 milliseconds. Now every 5,000 milliseconds, every 5 seconds therefore, this function will be executed by the browser when the application is running. So it's now inside of this function where I want to update current status. And here I want to generate a random value with math random. And I then simply want to check if random is smaller than 0.5, because math random will produce a value between 0 and 1, 1 excluded, so technically 0.9999. And if the value that was produced is smaller than 0.5, so in 50% of all cases in the end, I want to set this current status equal to online, let's say. Else if random is smaller than 0.9, so it's bigger than 0.5 but smaller than 0.9, in this case I want to set the current status to offline. And in the remaining 10% of cases, I want to set current status to unknown. Now, one thing you might want to consider doing here when working with hard-coded values like this is set up a type that only accepts these kinds of values. And you can do this in TypeScript by explicitly assigning a type to current status, which will disable its inference for this property, because by default it would infer that current status should be of type string. But here I want to be more specific that it's one of these 3 strings. And you can do that with TypeScript by disabling the inference for this property, by explicitly assigning a type. And then you can set up the 3 string values that should be accepted as a union type, so separated by that pipe symbol. And that tells TypeScript that current status must be a string that's either online, offline, or unknown. And if I had a typo down there, I would quickly see, because I would get an error, that the type offline written like that is not assignable to my type here. And that's why you might want to do that and be a bit more explicit, because it can help avoid typos like this. Well, but with that, we're setting up this interval. And now if you save that and you reload, you should see that this value should change from time to time. And it's random, so of course you can't tell how often it will change to which value. But you see now it's unknown, and eventually it will change again to offline, as it seems. At some point it might also be online. Now it is. So that's therefore working. But that wasn't even the main thing I wanted to do here, though it is an important step in the right direction. Here I'm using the constructor of this component class to set up an interval whenever this class is instantiated, so whenever this component is created in the end. Now, you can use the constructor for tasks like this, it's not wrong, but it's typically recommended that you use a different component method, because all those Angular components go through a component life cycle. And that simply means that when Angular instantiates and renders that component, and when it then checks it for changes in the future, certain lifecycle hooks are triggered by Angular. Certain methods you can add to your component class to run code at certain points in time of this component's lifecycle. We already saw the constructor, but there, for example, also is an ngOnInit method you can add to a component, because as you learn in the official docs, and a link to this article is attached, this ngOnInit method will be executed by Angular whenever Angular has initialized this component's inputs. So whenever it essentially is done initializing this component. There also are some other hooks, and I'll say right away that you typically don't need all of them. Some of them are for pretty niche cases, but I'll get back to them later. For the moment, it's this ng on init hook I'm interested in. To get Angular to execute it, all you have to do is go to your component where you want to do something at that point in the component lifecycle, and you add the ng on init method to that component class. That's all. Now Angular will execute it. It only needs to be there. So now we can grab that code from the constructor and instead execute it in ng on init. Now, even though it did work in the constructor without problems, and even though it wouldn't be wrong for simple use cases and applications like this, you should actually prefer using ng on init for initialization work like setting up this interval. It is considered a good practice in Angular applications to keep your constructor lean and only do basic class initialization work in there. So if you want to assign some initial class property values or things like that. Anything else, especially more complex tasks like sending HTTP requests, which we'll do later in the course, should not go into the constructor, but instead into ng on init. In addition, as you can also see in the official documentation, one difference between the constructor and ng on init also is that in ng on init, Angular is done initializing the component inputs. So if your component receives any input values, those values will be initialized and will be available in ng on init, whereas that is not the case in the constructor. So that might be another reason for using ng on init, but as mentioned in general, you should simply prefer it over the constructor to follow that recommended best practice. With that change made, if you save that, you'll see that if you reload, this application still works the same it did before. Eventually, the server status will change.